All right. Hello and welcome. Brett here with ClickMill.co. In this video, we've got Juke and Zach, and we're going to talk about what we might call anthropic constants. Now, this is very similar and probably is just an extension of the teleological argument, which is the argument from design, right? If something is designed, then it has a designer. And how much chance are we really willing to accept in our worldview? Because at some point, when you get to a lot of chance, you're just moving into the area of faith. And of course, that's a decision each person makes for themselves. Now, I think that we'll separate this conversation out from the prior conversation. In the last conversation we had on the teleological argument, we were talking about the design, the anthropic constants that are in physics from the beginning, and that's more related to cosmology. What is the strong nuclear force and the exact number ascribed to it? What is the weak nuclear force, the electromagnetic force, the speed of light, the gravitational constant? There are all of these within physics and the very fabric and the nature of reality in our universe. They have to be exact. Otherwise, any type of conceivable life is impossible. And so, for example, and I think I mentioned this in the prior training, but if you increase the strong nuclear force, you have atoms that crush in on themselves because it's too strong. And if you weaken it, you can't have atoms because it brings the elementary particles, protons, neutrons, and electrons, it brings them together. So if you change that even the tiniest bit, you can't even have atoms. And of course, if there's no atoms, there's no conceivable life. The atheist, of course, would be like, well, there could be life outside of atoms. And it's like, all right, cool. Well, I don't know. There could be a flying magical Easter bunny I don't know about. And I guess that's possible too. We can make things up all day. But conceivable life, not conceivable without these constants. And those would be anthropic constants. Now, there's also another sort of way to talk about anthropic constants, and it's not as fundamental as these sort of fundamental preset forces of nature. As we move to anthropic constants that maybe are more relevant to Earth specifically, and how is life even able to live on Earth at all? And so this is moving out of the physics and more into the placement of Earth and the environment in Earth and how likely or unlikely that is. And so that is just kind of introing this sort of second way to talk about anthropic constants or the teleological, the design of the system we live in. And Juke, I'll hand it off to you if you want to pick it up there, and you can just start pulling apart some of these constants or however you'd like to go from there.
Yeah, sounds good. If you hear a crying baby in the background, that is my son. Don't worry about it. Um, so first of all, the word, I don't know if you went over the word anthropos,
Nope.
anthropic principle, anthropic constants. The word anthropos means man or human. So it is the idea
Hmm.
that the universe and the earth and these different things were created with man in mind,
I
that it
did
was
not know that.
created. Yeah, it was created to have the proper conditions for people to live. So I'll just start. I'll just kind of go over um, uh, a general understanding of these things. And so we're talking about the Earth. So we can talk about gravity. Okay, so gravity is one of the forces that binds the universe, the Earth included, of course. Imagine, walking or running and you just don't stop, right? You jump and you just keep going. If they're finely tuned, slight change in the constants of gravity, and the universe would not exist. Gravity is like an invisible hug that keeps us from floating into space. Stronger or weaker, and the essential elements would never form. Another one is, let's see, that's the expansion rate of the universe. You probably already talked about that. The electromagnetic force, you already talked about that. Also, Earth sits in what's referred to as the Goldilocks zone. So again, this just highlights the Goldilocks, not too the the principle that you're going to constantly hear in the fine-tuning argument is if it was a little bit more, it wouldn't be sustainable. If it was a little bit less, it wouldn't be sustainable. It has
And
to be
if I can,
just
Juke,
right.
in regard to the solar system, if we're too close to the sun, the atmosphere and everything's going to be too hot to sustain life. And if you're further out, you're back by Mars or Jupiter. Now it's too cold. So that's why it's Goldilocks. We're not too hot. We're not too cold. And that's also relevant with the Milky Way galaxy. Our solar system fits within the Goldilocks zone of the galaxy, where if we're closer to the center of the galaxy, there's way too much instability. Stars are throwing off their planets as they come in, bump into the orbits of other stars. But if you're too far out, you're going to get flung off into space, into interstellar space, where, it's not ideal conditions for solar systems either. So
Right.
also, we're in two Goldilocks zones simultaneously.
Right, absolutely. Earth's distance from the sun, the atmospheric composition of the atmosphere, and magnetic field are precisely what is needed to sustain life. Another important thing on Earth is liquid water. We have, right, water can be a liquid, then poof, it can be a steam, then poof, it can be ice. And so, and the way that frozen ice floats on top of the water is, I think other than water, everything else would be heavier. But because frozen ice can float on top of the water and ice over a pond, the living things in that pond can continue living, right? Otherwise, the whole pond would just freeze up and everything would die. So those are, again, conditions that are set the way they are with liquid water. In order to have liquid water, it requires certain conditions. If we were closer to the sun, as Brett was talking about, all of that water would evaporate. If we were farther away, then we would freeze. So another thing on Earth is our air. Okay, our air is about 78% nitrogen, about some will say 79, about 20% oxygen, some will say 21, but again, about 78% nitrogen, 20% oxygen, and about 2% other gases, argon and various other gases. If we had a little more oxygen, so if we were 25% oxygen, um, we would have forest fires everywhere. Everything would what's the word? But anyway, everything would burn up. We would have forest fires everywhere. Whereas if we were less oxygen, say 15% or less, we would not have enough oxygen to breathe.
Yep.
Um, Earth's Earth's distance from the sun, we talked about that.
Something
Uh,
else I'd add in there as well is so you also have the life forms on Earth which affect the system. So, for example, humans, we breathe in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide. But what happens when all of the mammals and reptiles and humans are doing that for a prolonged period of time? The oxygen content in the atmosphere drops below what is capable of sustaining life. And so you have to have a reverse system, a very convenient and reverse system that breathes in our carbon dioxide and breathes out oxygen. And of course, what does all plant life do? That's what plant life does. And so you have this extraordinarily convenient system that supposedly evolved, but I mean, even that is chance. And it's like, what is the likelihood that these two things not only evolved, but evolved together so that they have supported each other the entire time without running into this system critical? We have too much carbon dioxide or too much oxygen in the atmosphere simultaneously. That alone
yeah.
is some serious chance. And then beyond that, I'd also add in, did you talk about the size and mass of the moon and the distance of the moon from the Earth?
I was going to get into that. Yep,
Yeah,
but
take it.
there it is. There it is. Yeah, the moon is basically perfectly sized to stabilize Earth's tilt,
Yeah.
preventing extreme climate variations and allowing a stable environment for life.
Right. The 23-degree axial tilt is what gives us the seasons. But if you have more, you have much more dramatic seasons where you're looking more like, Mars is super hot on one side and super cold on the other, something to that
Yeah,
effect.
what if winter
Right.
never ended?
Right. And then, oh, and also I would add to the moon point, the moon, the distance and the size is exactly kind of what you would need to have a tide that circulates oxygen in the ocean so you can have marine life, but also it's because the tide pull, the moon pulls the tide, right? The gravity of the moon, not, how do I say this? It's not just the gravity of the earth that pulls the moon. The moon also pulls the earth. And as it goes around the earth, it pulls the tide. This is where we get the high tide and the low tide. The high tide is just constantly under the moon because the moon is pulling the water that direction. Well, this creates the basis for the undersea currents and the oxygenation of the ocean so that you can have marine life and plants in the water, and that creates the potential for life underwater, and it keeps the oceans from stagnating. Well, if you had a moon further away, there wouldn't be enough tide for this and ocean currents. If it was too close, you would have something like tsunamis all over the world, like that, like that one planet in Interstellar that's just covered in water, and the tsunami just goes around the Earth, goes around the planet all the time. Well, you can't have life with too much tidal tumultuousness, I guess, either. And I think there's a wider range of what could be accepted there. At least, obviously, a little closer, you're probably not going to get giant tsunamis, but still, that is part of the kind of tidal system that oxygenates the water. So,
Yeah, yeah. A couple other things. Our planet's crust is just the right thickness. If it were thicker, too much oxygen would be locked up in the rocks.
hmm,
If it were thinner, volcanic and tectonic activity would make life impossible to maintain.
wow.
Earth's core generates a magnetic field that shields us from harmful solar radiation, a necessity for life to thrive. Earth's ability to maintain, like you were saying, just the right levels of carbon dioxide is
Mhm.
vital for maintaining a climate that supports life. The balance of protons to electrons, um, we can't just take that for granted. That balance ensures electrical neutrality necessary for complex chemistry.
Hmm.
If you had more protons than electrons, or more protons, then it would be, you wouldn't have that neutrality there. And same thing with more electrons than protons.
Wow.
So the question is, did it just happen by chance? I mean, and some people will try and point to Christians and as the God of the gaps argument. Well, we don't understand it. Well, a lot of atheists use the chance of the gaps argument, which is we don't get it, or so we're just gonna say chance did it.
Yeah.
And so, either one, it's better that we should be exploring what
The
actually,
likelihood.
the science, yeah, what is the evidence showing us?
Right.
So,
And something I would say, how does the atheist make that argument? At least in my experience and from, debates I've seen and debates I've kind of been in, and I say debates, I don't really debate people, but when I've heard them defend this position, it's sort of like it's not the cleanest argument, but it kind of makes sense where they would say, well, yeah, is it super unlikely? Sure. But also, because how do I say this? Is it really, really unlikely that this is the planet of all the planets we've ever seen and all the telescopes? Is it possible it's the only planet that can sustain life? Yes. And then they would then say, but the fact that you're asking the question is just necessitated. Like, of course, you're going to be asking the question because you're the only being in the universe that can ask that question. So
yeah,
of course you're asking it, but that's a really unusual way to kind of put that reasoning together. It's
yeah,
on
it's not an explanation.
right.
That is not an explanation. Somebody commented on our DNA video that just that same thing.
Yeah.
And what I've heard, the way I've heard it refuted, it's not an explanation to just say, well, we're all here, so I guess everything just worked out. It would be similar to saying, to taking, okay, we're gonna have in a room we're going to have the 20 best sharpshooters in the world and bring them in one room. And we're
Mm-hmm.
going to have a person with a target on their chest. And for 1 minute, we're going to let the sharpshooters, the best in the world, from 20 feet away, we're going to let them just go ham on that target. And then guess what? After a minute, the smoke clears and nobody hit the target. The guy's fine. He's fine, you know? And so it would be the similar to saying, well, how did that happen? And people just say, well, you know, he's fine. He's in a good position, so we don't really have to answer the question of why. We're not asking.
He's the one that got lucky. Of course, he's the one that was like, wow, it's of
Yeah, yeah.
course.
So we're asking, no, we understand that. It's how did that happen? What is the best explanation for why the universe is the way that it is?
Got it.
Not just that we're asking the question. So, you know
So
what I
it
mean?
actually circumvents answering. It just says, well, you're the person that's here to ask it. So of course you're asking it because you're the only one, but that doesn't actually answer the question. That's interesting. I haven't heard that.
Yes.
That makes sense. Cool. Okay. What else? Anything else? Any other
Um,
things you want to go into there?
um, those are the main hits on the fine tuning. Again, there's over 200 of these,
Yep.
you know, and it can go on and on, but those are kind of the highlights.
Great.
You have the expansion rate of the universe. You have
Yeah.
the mass density of the universe.
These are
If
going back to the physics.
yeah, if the expansion rate were different from 1 in 10 to the 37th, no life would exist. If the mass density of the universe was different by more than 1 in 10 1 times 10 to the 59th,
Hmm.
no life would exist.
Yeah.
You know, it goes on and on. The gravitational
Gravitational constant.
anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, and now the reason why I think I was separating those two, and it's not that you have to, because I mean, it all ultimately is like the, the fine tuning is just incomprehensibly, like when you look at the math, that one constant you just said has 59 zeros behind it, but there's like within physics, there are dozens of those that have even more zeros. But then beyond that, you've got all of the constants for the Earth that have to be met as well. It's what is the actual likelihood? It's unbelievable. But usually when I hear people like, for example, Dr. William Lane Craig talk about those, he will usually focus in more on the physics constants because it seems like those are much less likely. And also, there's only one universe that we can speak to with evidence, whereas there's a gajillion, solar systems. So they can actually point to other solar systems and say, well, look, there's a lot of options. But when they point to the universe specifically with those sort of universal constants, they really can't point to other universes without making a faith claim because there is no evidence of other universes because time, space, matter, it all comes from the Big Bang. So as soon as you point to another universe outside of our universe prior or outside of our Big Bang, it's immediately a faith claim. So I think you can't, not that you couldn't argue all of that if you had a good conversation going with someone, but if I were going to start, I would start with the universal constants because they say, well, there's, there's an infinite number of universes out there and we're just the one. How do you know there's other universes out there? And you've immediately got them into a corner that you can't really answer reasonably. So that's kind of why I separated those two.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
It's just my opinion too. That's the way I would take it, but it's not to say that it's right. Uh, cool. Any other thoughts or comments? I mean, we got plenty of time left if anybody's wanting to do anything else in there.
I mean, we literally just did a video on this, and so we're getting do you want to hear some of what people are arguing?
Yeah,
Would you
let's
like?
hear some of that because this is kind of more real world debate type stuff.
Okay. All right, so let me just go to the video. All right, so one person said, someone said, what about survival bias? Which was the first time I had to look that up.
Hmm.
survivorship bias. Um, and let me see. Have you heard of that before?
Honestly, I have not heard of it, but if you are the species that survives, then you would be biased to thinking, like that sounds kind of like what we were talking about. Like, well, you're the only
Yes.
one left, so of course you're the one saying,
Yeah, it's kind of what it sounds like. Like you might think that if there's 1,000 people in a room and you don't know about the other 999, you would just assume that the fact that you survived is evidence of something amazing having happened. But then
right?
it turns out that the rest of them did
I,
die. So
can I share my screen here,
Yeah, yeah.
Brett?
Let me enable it.
Okay, you tell me when.
You're good to go.
Okay, share screen. All right, so here we go. Share. All right, so that was the first one where first of all, this guy said, wow, your channel is criminally underrated for this level of quality. Love that, love that.
Whoa,
But
whoa.
then he went on to just talk about the survivorship thing. And so I basically gave him the example that I just talked to you guys about, the bullseye being 10 feet away. Because survivorship bias, like you guys were saying, it's basically saying that we are only able to question our existence because it happened.
Right,
And so and then we're going to get a whole bunch of atheists who just want to be mean. So
right,
get ready for that. But this person said, you mean the argument that already got exposed 1,000 times? That means they don't have anything to say. So they're just
right.
getting knocked. Um,
hmm,
let's see. Uh,
You're in like
that one was
800
that one
debates
was
a day.
solid right there. It just said no, it doesn't. I mean, that's
I know.
right there,
I know. This
irrefutable.
guy said, yeah. So
Yep.
that's
Yeah,
what
yeah.
that on that comment, we have no, it doesn't. Yep, yep. And yeah, there are over 200 nuh-uh. So there you go.
The
Nuh-uh.
sophistication.
The sophistication.
Yeah.
But I,
Um,
I will point this out though. When you and so firstly, the online and offline, when you're talking to atheists, you know what? Let me pause this because I want to put this maybe into a little bit of a different video. So I'm going to pause this video. We'll pick it up in another one here because I want to point out something that's interesting in here. All
okay.
right. So if you're watching, we'll see you in the next video. We're going to pick up filming there now.